بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. صاحب السمو الشيخ محمد بن زايد آل نهيان ولي عهد أبو ظبي، نائب القائد الأعلى للقوات المسلحة، سمو الشيوخ، أصحاب المعالي والسعادة، الضيوف الكرام، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. اسمحوا لي بداية بالتعريف عن نفسي. معكم طيف محمد الأميري، مدير إدارة اتصال حكومي بوزارة التغير المناخي والبيئة، ويشرفني اليوم أن أتولى مهمة إدارة هذا الحوار في هذا المجلس الكريم. اسمحوا لي الآن بأن أكمل حديثي باللغة الإنجليزية. Your Highnesses, Your Excellencies, Ladies and Gentlemen, we are pleased to have with us today Mr. Pavan Sukhdev, the Goodwill Ambassador for the United Nations Environment and the President of the World Wildlife Fund International, the global organization for the conservation of nature. Mr. Sukhdev is a sustainability thought leader and an influential voice among international policymakers and institutions. He started his career in finance and banking, then spearheaded some of the international community's leading initiatives, including the United Nations Environment Programme's Green Economy Initiative. Mr. Sukhdev has also developed new business models that prepare companies for the world of tomorrow, while carefully factoring in society and the environment. To help us understand how to achieve balance across different dimensions of wealth and how today's cooperation can deliver tomorrow's green and sustainable economy, Mr. Sukhdev will focus on the topic of redefining wealth for an economy of permanence in today's lecture. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Pavan Sukhdev.
Thank you. Your Highness, the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, Your Highnesses, Excellencies, friends, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great privilege and a pleasure for me to be here with you today in your majlis. The topic that I wish to speak with you is something that affects everyone. It is for governments, policymakers, it is for businesses, it is for people, and it is about wealth. I would like to describe to you how we can redefine wealth to develop for ourselves the economy and the society of tomorrow. And when I talk about this, it is in the context of a world and a time where we, the humankind, are now being described by the scientists as a force of nature. We are changing the world upon which we live. This is for the first time. In fact, they have called our era the Anthropocene era, which means the age of man. We have become an ecological force that is changing the surface of this planet. We have deforestation beyond belief. We have got acidification of the oceans that affects coral reefs and fisheries. Freshwater scarcity is affecting large countries, including India and China. And the climate is breaking down. And all of this is because of the activities of our economy and the way that we have designed our economic model. We consume as if resources are unlimited. We pollute as if the impacts are irrelevant. Unfortunately, we should be measuring and we should be managing with our ability to influence the environment. We should be managing it, but we don't measure it. And the sad thing is that the only things that we do measure really address one dimension of wealth, which is produced wealth, man-made wealth. And that we measure very well. We have GDP to measure the amount of output that a country generates. We have profit and loss to see the value added that a company generates. These measurements we make well. But what about measuring human wealth, human health, which is a very important part of our human wealth? What about measuring knowledge and skills, which enable us to do jobs and earn money and add to the economy? What about measuring nature and ecosystem services? In other words, measuring the value that nature delivers to our economies and our society. We don't seem to measure that, even though it is so important. Clean air, fresh water, how would we survive without that? The fact that we have so far lived in a stable climate, that is, of course, natural wealth as well. And what about social relationships? What about the institutions of society, which enable all of these other forms of wealth to actually generate incomes? Imagine a world in which employees don't come on time and don't do hard work and don't commit, and employers don't pay them on time. What kind of economy would we have then if we did not have relationships between employers and employees, or formal relationships? So these are some of the things that are there. We recognize that they are important parts of wealth, but we are not accounting for them, and we are not therefore being able to manage them. So we have a little bit like this one-legged chair or one-legged stool. We are trying to balance without the other three legs in place. I want to talk to you about a world which has actually been seen before. In fact, this problem that I described to you was talked about by the economist and systems thinker Kenneth Boulding as far back as 1965, when he talked about the economy of his times being what he called a cowboy economy, one in which there is again this notion of limitless resources, and he said it was false. And he talked about how we, in that time, I'm talking about the 1960s, were already extracting too much from the planet and polluting it too much. And of course, 50 years later, the problems are only more acute. And he said even at that time that an economy to be effective and to be successful over a long period of time has to recognize resource limits. So he wrote a book, among his many books, he wrote a book called Spaceship Earth. And he saw the world's economy that we need actually as a spaceman economy, not a cowboy economy. And that was Kenneth Boulding in 1965. And this wisdom was there even earlier. In 1945, another economist talked about the need for an economy of permanence. He saw the Earth economy as being too unstable, too dangerous, and too unable to meet the needs of society over a long period of time. He talked about an economy of permanence, and this was a Cambridge economist called J.C. Kumarappa, who in fact was Mahatma Gandhi's favorite economist. He talked about an economy of permanence inspired by the economies of nature. And he said that there were 5 different models of the economy which were found in nature. And he said that the ones that were most prevalent were the wrong ones. He wanted to make people see that actually the economies that were there at the time, I'm talking about 1940s, were the economies of predation and the economies of parasitism. Predation means where, like a monkey, you go to an orchard and you steal the fruit from it. You don't damage the orchard, you take the fruit, but you don't add anything to the economy. It's a one-sided system. It could be worse, an economy of parasitism. Now, this is a fig tree, which is a parasite on another tree, which basically consumes from the other tree all the nutrients, and the other tree dies. So, in fact, that is an even worse kind of economy of parasitism, where the host dies as a result of your actions, and you may also die in the consequence. But he also described positive examples from nature. An economy of gregation, which is a community of bees, a hive of bees, which works very hard and collects nectar from flowers and collects foods for the young bees, but does so for the community, not for itself. It does so to create a pot within society, which is important. So not private gains, but public gains. And then he talked about business, which is, he says, an economy of enterprise. And he gave, again, an example from nature, how a butterfly does business, if you like, with a flower by taking the nectar from the flower, but also in the process providing pollination, an ecosystem service, as we call it nowadays. So it was an exchange, and a proper economic exchange happening in nature. And then he talked about the ultimate service economy, which he says is the economy in which the mother feeds the child. And he saw that in all species, in all animals, birds, and every part of nature, there is a selflessness of service where the importance of the child is actually placed above that of your own. And he said that in order for humanity to survive, we needed to move away from the current economy, which he says described as mainly one of predation and parasitism, into economies of service, of gregation, and of enterprise of this kind. So one of the interesting observations that comes from reading these old thinkers is that they actually saw society the way it should be seen, which is not just in one tier of private wealth, but also community wealth and also public wealth. And they saw that wealth is not just man-made and and financial, but it's also natural, it's also human, it's also about relationships between actors within society. These aspects, in my opinion, are actually essential for us to be able to redefine wealth. These aspects that are alluded to by these old thinkers refer to natural wealth, they refer to human wealth, and they refer to social wealth in addition to produced wealth. And I think all of these, as you will agree, are essential towards human progress. We can't only be sitting or trying to be stable on a one-legged stool. So how would we define the concept of wealth? Well, we have just mentioned that we must look at not just the different types of wealth, but we must also look at the different forms of ownership. You can have private ownership, you can have ownership in community, and we refer to that in economics in club goods, and public ownership. Let us look at produced wealth. Even produced wealth exists in different forms of ownership. Factories, buildings, cash, investments, securities, intellectual property, software, patents, licenses, these are owned privately. They can be traded in markets. But there are other things which are meant for communal usage. A community center, such as one which we are here today, belongs to the community. It is not something that can be traded in a marketplace. You cannot buy or sell. A school, a local community school, is for the community and for the children. And there are public produced wealth, such as roads, bridges, and hospitals, and so on and so forth. And these are all manufactured, the financial and manufactured wealth. But of course, there is also, in addition to that, human wealth. What makes us productive, what makes us healthy, the human health that we have, the education, and the skills that we have to do the jobs that we do. And that belong to us. Nobody can take away my skill from me or your skill from you. But of course, there is also human wealth that exists in communities. And there are many communities around the world who have special knowledge of the local plants and the flowers and the animals and the birds and the bees, which they use for all kinds of purposes, including medication. And in fact, bioprospecting, the idea that big companies can identify what works to cure what diseases, and then actually go and identify the molecule, is a common way in which pharmaceutical companies do business. They identify cures, and they see and try and research which molecule, and then they produce those molecules at an industrial scale. So bioprospecting recognizes traditional community knowledge, and part of the Convention on Biological Diversity tries to ensure that when this traditional knowledge goes from the community to the company, it goes at a fair price so that the community is appropriately rewarded. And then, of course, there is public knowledge. Wikipedia, so much can be found today on the web. So even human wealth exists in three layers: privately owned, community owned, and publicly owned. And last but not the least, of course, of the wealths that generate incomes, natural wealth, because we have many cases of mines and fields owned by private interests, and private forests also do exist. But then we have community forests and community grazing areas. These are community-owned aspects of natural wealth. And then, of course, we have publicly owned natural wealth, such as the high seas, the forests, the fisheries, the national parks. And you here in Abu Dhabi, you have many national parks. Almost 30% of your land is covered with national parks, and 14% of your oceans, I understand. So these are natural wealth which are owned in public terms. And to tie all these together, we need what we refer to as social wealth. Social wealth works at the private level because without rules, regulations for markets, even markets would not work properly. People will not deliver and settle on time. There would be securities problems, there would be chaos, there would be scandals, and so on and so forth. And social wealth, of course, is the heart and soul of the community, because without that community norms and culture and rules that the community obeys, there would not be a community. And then, of course, social wealth comes also in the form of law and order, formal institutions like the constitutions of a country, and informal institutions like the respect for cultural diversity, the desire for communal harmony, living together, and the need for equity, understanding that everyone deserves a good standard of living. So these forms of wealth can actually be measured, and that's the good news. Here is an example of measurements of countries that you will immediately recognize as the countries that Abu Dhabi looks at in its 2030 vision, which is Ireland, New Zealand, Singapore, Norway. And you will see that there is a sense of alarm here. You can see that the natural wealth, as measured by the United Nations in their Inclusive Wealth Report 2018, which is the third round of measurements, shows a decline in all of these countries except one, which is New Zealand, which is because their afforestation efforts are successful and the value of their agricultural lands is going up. Here in Abu Dhabi, also there has been, like everybody else, there is a decline in natural wealth because oil is being extracted, and therefore measured in a comparable basis, it is now 93%. But what is worrying is because population increases, the per capita availability of natural wealth is declining. So I think here, this is something to be concerned about and to keep in mind in planning forward. There is a big difference between the declines overall wealth and per capita wealth. Now, if we look at per capita wealth and we look at all of the countries of the world, and again, this is based on the United Nations Inclusive Wealth Report, which is the first one that actually looks at wealth in 4 dimensions, we will find something interesting. We'll find that there are, of course, the colors of the dots that you see out here. The gray dots are low income, the blue dots are middle income, and the black dots are high income countries. And you will notice that when I've drawn this chart, it looks at the natural capital, the natural wealth component, the fraction of the total wealth of the country that is natural wealth, that is drawn along the x-axis. And along the y-axis, the human capital, knowledge, skills, human health, that is drawn along the y-axis. And you will notice something interesting is that most of the developed countries in Europe and the US are clustering around the top left-hand corner. So they have a typical pattern of wealth, which is that most of their wealth is actually human wealth. And that's an interesting idea and an interesting learning. And the red dot in the circle is United Arab Emirates. So you are somewhere in the middle here. To me, when economists talk about development policies, I keep reminding them, please, development means going there. So this is not about playing a different strategy with natural wealth. It is actually about thinking a different strategy with human wealth. What can you do to develop human capital in order to get there? If we just think what this means for the United Arab Emirates, I'm picking the countries in this just to make the diagram more easy to understand. Just the 5 countries that we are looking at in the Abu Dhabi Vision 2030, which is New Zealand, Norway, Ireland, and Singapore. And here again, you see a wide distribution of the different countries. Singapore and Ireland and Norway are in the same box, that left-hand box that you had seen earlier. They are there. Whereas United Arab Emirates and New Zealand are at a different space. New Zealand because of the huge amount of natural capital that it has in terms of forests and agricultural lands. But the desired pathways for everyone are in that direction. And if we look at another way of measuring this, which is Human Capital Index, the so-called Human Development Index, Human Capital Index is a large part of that. And on the y-axis, we look at GDP per capita, which is again a common way of economists measuring the strength of economies and the value that individuals get from the economy. We look at a US dollar axis, and there Singapore is very much at the high end, and the others, that is United Arab Emirates and Norway and Ireland, are somewhere in between, and then at the bottom is New Zealand. So again, the movement pathway is clearly in that direction that you are targeting, and I'm very pleased to see that this balance, this change between income that comes out of natural wealth economies such as oil GDP and the income that comes out of services such as the non-oil GDP. I'm very pleased to see that in your vision for Abu Dhabi 2030, this is actually what you are forecasting, a decline in the oil part of the economy from 46 to 36%, but an increase at the same time from 54 to 64% of the non-oil economy. But to achieve any change, we have to remember one key thing, which is that the private sector is a very large part of the economy. So when we want change in the economy, we need to change in the private sector as well. And this is not just a story here, which is the statistic that we have on the UAE of 70% of the economy of GDP being private sector, but globally. Globally, about 60% of the economy is private sector, and the same with jobs. In the US, it is 75% of GDP and 74% of jobs. So the private sector is a very big part of the economy. So achieving change in the economy and the direction of the economy becomes very difficult unless you achieve change in the private sector, because resource use and economic direction is largely being driven by this massive engine of the economy, which is the private sector. So the question then arises, how do we make the impacts of companies measurable and manageable? Because without measuring those impacts and managing those impacts, how will we achieve positive contributions to human health and to human wealth and so on? Are we doing this? I would frankly say that around the world, this is not happening yet. Most countries, majority, do not measure the true performance of companies. And therefore, as a result, when they are contributing positively to human wealth, as I will describe in a moment, or if they are contributing negatively to natural wealth, as I will also describe, actually rewards and penalties are not being aligned with what we want as a society. And addressing this is an opportunity. So here's an example when we are trying to address this, let us say, in terms of human wealth. People normally think of universities as the place where you go to learn. I taught for a while at Yale University, but a bigger university than Yale is run by a company called Infosys in India, which is one of the large information technology majors in India. They created this training center in the city of Mysore in 2002, and they've upgraded it in 2009. It's a massive center that trains 14,000 to 15,000 students continuously. That is bigger than Yale University, which has 12,000 students. Since it's a 6-month course, a very intensive course of converting graduates into information technology experts, programmers and systems analysts and so on, they actually are training almost 30,000 people every year from one company. So they are effectively acting as a university. Of course, some of these people leave. About 15% is the attrition in the IT industry, and that's true here as well. And some of these people leave, but they carry with them to other parts of the world, to other parts of the country, to IBM, to California, to Silicon Valley. They carry with them the knowledge and the skills and the self-confidence that they have gained from the training and development that they received at this university, which gave them the skills which added to their human wealth. And we measured how much that is, and it's huge. It's more than $1 billion per year of value that is being passed out from the University of Infosys, if you like, into the outside world. These are so-called the positive externalities of this firm. And they are huge in two ways. One, $1 billion is a lot of money, but secondly, if you look at what was invested by the company in that training center, it was less than $500 million at the time it was built. So this is a huge result, which is showing us that, in fact, the private sector can be a generator of human wealth. Your Highnesses, Your Excellencies, I would like to now summarize the key message that I have for you today, which is that moving the economy in a direction which grows all 4 pillars of wealth is actually very much in the hands of the government and the policymakers. Because if you look at the 4 strategies that I described to you today, which will help move the economy in this right direction, all 4 of them are driven by some change in the policy environment. And I address 4 changes in the policy environment. One is to do with taxation. Another is to do with financing and leverage. A third, again, regulation, is to do with advertising. And a fourth is to do with measuring and reporting true performance, the actual performance of the company, not just the profit for the shareholder. So let's begin with the taxation. We have a typical challenge of most of the world using a taxation system which essentially taxes the goods and does not tax the bad. Hard work is a good thing. It should generate income, it does, and that income gets taxed. Corporate innovation and enterprise, ingenuity, innovation, these are good things. The company applies that and makes profit, and on the profit we put tax, corporation tax. What we are not taxing enough is the bads, the pollution, the climate emissions, the extraction of minerals from the soil or the oceans. We are basically working in a system where the revenue of the government from taxation is in fact taxing the good things that it wants and not taxing the bad things that it doesn't want. So in a sense, we are doing the opposite of what we really want to do, taxing the goods and not taxing the bads. This can be changed. And Examples of that are many, and they're piling up. I think the Norwegian case, I think you're all familiar with, 79% tax on fossil fuels that has helped them build their oil fund, their national wealth fund, to $1 trillion. There are examples from Berkeley in California, which started taxing sugar-sweetened beverages, because sugar-sweetened beverages tend to be associated with an increase in diabetes. And there are places like Melbourne City, which has an epidemic of childhood diabetes. So taxing sugar-sweetened beverages, basically Coke, Pepsi, and all these things, actually increases their price, reduces the demand, and in fact reduces the incidence of these diseases. So parents will not give 2 cans of Coke to their children for tiffin, for example, when they have to pay more. Mexico has achieved an actual decline. The United Kingdom has also put in a tax on sugar. So these things are possible. And I know that you are also working on these, and you already have some of these. Advertising today is considered by some as a small sector because it's only $500 billion, $450 billion, $500 billion industry. But actually, it's a small sector with a very large voice, because it is advertising that preys on human insecurities, converts those insecurities into wants, wants into needs, needs into demand, demand into production, production into profits. That whole chain is basically started by advertising. We are more or less told by 24/7 media what to buy, where to buy, how many and how often to buy, and again and again. So this whole area, because it is free, it also has certain consequences. It creates the economy of our times, and it creates the sort of problems that I have described to you earlier. So there is good news again here, because we can have ethical advertising. Advertising of tobacco and alcoholic beverages and print is banned in many places, including here in the United Arab Emirates. And Ireland has a voluntary code of practice to reduce what they call junk food advertising to children below a certain age. And Australia has clear health warnings and bans on all cigarette packing, and very aggressively. In fact, cigarette smoking has gone down in Australia as a result of that. So it is possible to work on the ethics of advertising to make it more effective and make it more informative, less persuasion, more information. You would remember, my friends, that the world has been beset by many recessions over time. But if we think of what caused those recessions, whether it's the Latin American debt crisis in the 1970s, or the Savings and Loan Association collapse in the US in the 1980s, or for that matter, the Asian credit crisis in 1998, or for that matter, most recent in 2008, the global financial crisis. All of these have been basically driven by the same problem, which is our lack of appreciation of the role of leverage. In other words, of borrowing. Shareholder capital, that is capital belonging to the shareholder, is fine. But the moment you start leveraging it, the moment you go to the banking sector and now to the markets, you are very rarely asked to actually show and disclose and convince people of the purpose of that financing. The idea that the privity of relationship between the banker and the company is going to decide that the right purpose is there is no longer true. If you don't get money from banks, you can go to the commercial paper market, or you can go to the debt market, you can go to the capital markets. So there's enough money available for financing almost anything. But misuse of leverage, such as happened in the case of the latest financial crisis through derivatives, or abuse of leverage, as happened in the case of the earlier crisis, or misunderstanding of leverage of people in Asia borrowing in dollars when they were actually exposed in local currencies. So all of these are aspects of crisis which have been driven by leverage, misapplication or misuse of leverage. We need control on leverage. Central banks have to step up to this reality. The central banks around the world, I think, are aware of this, but everyone seems to be hedging their bets and wondering who goes first. Well, this is a big problem, because without solving this, we are going to have the 5th financial crisis, again, which will be driven by misapplied or misused or abused leverage. And finally, I would say most importantly, let us ensure that the private sector, the giants of our economy, the engines of our economy, actually report their real results. Now, there's already good movements here. Singapore, for example, has insisted that all companies must issue ESG metrics. Environmental, social, and governance norms have to be published by companies in order for them to be listed. India has insisted that its top 500 companies have to issue what are called business responsibility reports. So you have to publish all your impacts in qualitative terms. But we must really try and bring this on par with financial reporting. So therefore, measuring impacts in economic terms should be focused on. And I give 4 examples here. AkzoNobel, a major European chemical firm; Holcim, the world's largest cement company; Yarra Valley Water, that is Melbourne's largest water utility; and Sveaskog, that is Sweden's largest forestry company. They own 14% of Sweden's forests. They have all published wealth reports, not just shareholder reports, but their impacts on human wealth, natural wealth, social wealth, and of course produced wealth, which is the balance sheet and profit and loss. It's called integrated profit and loss. It's a new form of accounting that has started. And all these companies that I mentioned have begun by discovering their impacts and going into detail as to what is causing these benefits or costs. Then using global best practice frameworks to measure these impacts, then using economic valuation to actually value these impacts, because when you put the numbers in dollars terms, then suddenly the finance director cannot run away from it. The CEO has to recognize the size of the health costs that you are inflicting at the same time as you make profits for the shareholder. And finally, when you have these numbers and you have the materiality of these numbers in front of you, that's when you start managing these impacts. You cannot manage what you do not measure, but on the flip side, when you do measure it, you start managing it. That is our human nature. That is how we react. And then for disclosure, for transparency, we should also inform society. After all, the corporation's license to operate is given by society. Why should society not know what are the real impacts of the corporation? I sometimes ask my friends and in my business, my clients, saying that, are you a responsible company? They say yes. Then I say, if you are a responsible company, you must disclose your impacts to society. Do you do so? And then we have a conversation. So these are some of the things that business performance focuses on: business permanence in order to achieve an economy of permanence. In summary, let me say this, that redefining wealth is absolutely necessary. And for transparency, we must ensure that we are asking companies to report all of their wealth impacts, not just their impacts on shareholders' produced wealth. This, my friends, is what will help us to transform business for tomorrow's world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Sukhdev. We will now start with the Q&A session. And before I open the floor for the audience, I'll put forth a few of my own. Mr. Sukhdev, with the Sustainable Development Goals, Paris Agreement, and other international treaties, how has the business community embraced the momentum we see today?
There is certainly a lot of willingness to participate in a changed economic system. And we saw that at Davos earlier this year in January, where there was a huge willingness to move forward towards what was known as a New Deal for nature and people. The idea that companies and governments should, and civil society should all collaborate to make a big difference. But today I find that some sectors have gone ahead, like there's a lot of good innovation and enterprise which has taken the renewable energy sector to levels of excellence that is really remarkable. Solar energy today is available at 2-3 cents per kilowatt hour, which used to be 10 times as high, 35-40 cents 10 years ago. So some sectors have really proved their worth, but other sectors are lagging behind, especially, for example, in food systems, where I find that the willingness of industry to ensure that they produce food which is healthy for people and healthy for the planet is not good enough. I find that the impacts on human health of pesticides and fertilizers, the impacts on soil of pesticides and fertilizers, these are not being accounted for. These chemicals are really bad for human health and they are bad for the nature. But there are different ways of farming which I find are available, and very few companies, I would say companies like Olam in Singapore and a few other companies, are really involved in the new form of agriculture which we are seeing as good for the climate, good for the environment, good for human health, and for safety. So I think I would, in summary, say that my answer to your question is mixed. Not all good, not all bad, but somewhere mixed.
We talked about big corporations. How about small, medium enterprises? How do they fit into the sustainability ecosystem?
These small and medium enterprises are actually really important from a social equity point of view, because they are the businesses which small communities run and individual businesses run. And there are literally about 300 odd million SMEs around the world. So this is huge. They are sometimes part of global value chains, so they work for producing components or for distributing the products of larger companies, and sometimes they're independent businesses which may become highly enterprising challenges to the mainstream businesses of our time, and they create a lot of innovation. The kind of work that I described to you, which is being done by the big companies that I mentioned, is quite expensive. So it's difficult for these small and medium enterprises to do that kind of reporting, that kind of responsibility. And this is where governments can come in as well and provide support. So if a small SME wants to report its full impacts, it should not have to pay thousands of dollars to a consultant. If it wants to change its technology to move into a different direction of lower impact and improved responsibility to society, that's where government policies should try and help them.
Thank you. How can technological advancements help us achieve an economy of permanence?
That's a great question, and I think it's a really important role. Technology has a huge role to play in providing change. And frankly, if we look today at the kind of technology we have, I mentioned the solar energy sector, but for that matter, in anything, for the internet, communications, the way in which the internet has completely, radically transformed our society. Indeed, human health, some of the medical advances that are taking place in the world today. So we look at technology as an enabler, but it's also a driver. It's a driver for change. 10 years ago, if I had suggested that, we can have renewable energy powering the planet, people would have laughed. But today, new technology has proved that, it is not true. It is actually possible. And today I'm beginning to say that, we can have a form of agriculture that recognizes that agriculture is about biology, not chemistry, and that it is actually producing more yields, safer food, and better food for people. People will say, really? And I will point out 3 very good projects that I know where this is happening. They'll say, but these are just 3 random examples. Tomorrow, maybe new technologies will come which will change this and make those biological farming enterprises become the mainstream. So I think technology really needs to be focused on. It is definitely a driver for the sustainable economy, the economy of permanence.
Thank you, Mr. Sukdev, for your invaluable insights. استأذنك سموي في اختتام المحاضرة. Here in UAE, the government recognizes the integral role of the private sector in building a sustainable future for all, and in advancing public-private partnership to promote green and circular economies. Our effort to ensure that economic development does not come at the expenses of the environment stem from our deep-rooted commitment to preserving our natural resources for future generations. So, Mr. Sukdev, I'm happy to point out that your business model has been applied successfully and will continue to achieve milestones in sustainability in this country. في الختام أتقدم بالشكر إلى صاحب السمو الشيخ محمد بن زايد آل نهيان ولي عهد أبو ظبي نائب القائد الأعلى للقوات المسلحة لتكرمه باستضافة هذا المجلس الموقر، وإلى السيد بافان سكديف لتزويدنا بالمعلومات القيمة. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.